The hostess at the front of the room smiled at me with the practiced warmth of someone paid to make strangers feel welcome. She did not recognize me. That was entirely intentional. I had chosen a tailored black dress and a pair of heels I had never worn around my husband, and I had worn my hair down instead of in the neat chignon he had grown so accustomed to seeing at our kitchen table every morning. I looked like exactly what I needed to look like tonight. An invited guest, arriving fashionably late, unhurried, and completely unbothered. I was neither. Behind me, two men in dark blazers waited with the quiet, measured patience of people who had done this before. They were not bouncers. They were not private security. They were process servers from the office of the Manhattan County Civil Court, and the documents tucked inside their inner jacket pockets bore the official seal of a federal judge who had signed them at 9 o'clock that morning. I smoothed the front of my dress, smiled back at the hostess, and stepped inside my husband's grand opening. The restaurant was everything he had promised it would be. I had seen the architectural renderings pinned above his desk for 3 years. I had listened to him describe the reclaimed wood ceiling beams and the open kitchen concept and the custom Italian marble bar top so many times that I could have drawn the floor plan from memory. Standing inside it now, I had to admit that the vision had translated beautifully into reality. The space was warm and golden, filled with the low hum of an expensive crowd, the clink of champagne flutes, and the intoxicating smell of the tasting menu being plated behind the glass kitchen wall. My husband stood at the center of it all, wearing a custom white chef's coat, with his name embroidered in navy thread above the chest pocket. Marcus. He was laughing at something a man in a gray suit was saying, his head thrown back with the easy, magnetic confidence I had fallen in love with 9 years ago. He looked like a man at the absolute peak of his life. He had not invited me to share it. 3 weeks ago, when I had asked him about the opening date and whether we should arrange for my parents to fly in from Chicago, he had looked at me across the breakfast table with the kind of carefully constructed vagueness that I had been watching him practice for the better part of a year. He said the guest list was being managed entirely by his publicist. He said it was going to be a tight, industry-only crowd. He said he wanted to keep the energy focused and professional. He said he would plan something special for just the two of us the following weekend. He said all of this while his phone was face down on the table, and while a woman named Brooke was already listed as co-host of the event on the restaurant's official Instagram account. I found out about Brooke 4 months before that breakfast conversation, though my husband did not know I knew. I am a meticulous person by nature. It is why I am good at my job. I manage a commercial real estate portfolio for a mid-sized investment firm in Midtown, and the single most important skill in that business is the ability to read a document carefully, identify what is missing, and trace every number back to its source. When I noticed that our joint savings account had dropped by $40,000 in the span of 6 weeks, I did not panic. I opened a spreadsheet and I started following the money. What I found took me 2 weekends and a consultation with a forensic accountant to fully piece together. My husband had been systematically funneling capital from our shared accounts into the LLC he had formed for the restaurant, an entity that I was technically listed as a silent investor in, but had never once been consulted about. Over the course of 14 months, he had moved $310,000 of our joint savings without my signature, using a power of attorney document that he had presented to me 2 years ago as routine paperwork for a home refinancing. I had signed it at the kitchen table while I was on a work call. I had trusted him. The total build-out of the restaurant had cost just over $700,000. My money accounted for nearly half of it. The rest had come from a small business loan that he had secured using the restaurant space itself as collateral, a space whose commercial lease was held by a property management company called Meridian Real Estate Ventures. I knew that name very well. I had created it. Meridian was a subsidiary LLC I had established 3 years earlier as part of a portfolio diversification strategy my firm had encouraged all senior staff to pursue. When my husband began searching for a permanent location for his restaurant, he had come to me excitedly one evening with a listing he had found. A gorgeous ground floor space in a boutique mixed-use building in the West Village. He said the asking lease rate was steep but manageable. He said the location was perfect. I had looked at the address, recognized it immediately as one of 3 commercial properties sitting inside my personal Meridian portfolio, and I had made a decision in the space of about 4 seconds. I said nothing. I let his real estate broker submit the application. I let my own property manager process it through the standard channels. I let my husband sign a 5-year commercial lease with a company whose managing partner's signature at the bottom of every page was my maiden name, which he had apparently never once looked at closely enough to register. I had not planned to use any of this. For a long time, I had genuinely hoped I would never need to. I loved my husband. I had built a life with him, and I had believed, for most of that life, that he was building it back with me. But then there was Brooke. Brooke was 23 years old. She had 40,000 followers on Instagram, most of whom had found her through a series of aesthetically curated food content videos she had been posting for the past 18 months. She had met my husband at a culinary industry event, and within 6 weeks, she was listed on the restaurant's website as Director of Brand and Guest Experience, a title that did not appear to require any formal qualifications, only availability and a ring light. My husband had paid for her ring light, along with a new MacBook, a mirrorless camera, and a monthly styling budget that appeared on the restaurant LLC's books as marketing and content creation. I had found the receipts in a folder on our shared cloud drive that he had forgotten I still had access to. I had spent the 4 months since that discovery doing 3 things. First, I had moved the remainder of my personal savings into an account he had no visibility into. Second, I had met with a commercial litigation attorney named Sandra, who had reviewed every document I brought her and spent 45 minutes explaining my options with the focused calm of someone who genuinely enjoyed her job. Third, I had waited. I waited for the opening night because I understood the way my husband had never quite understood about me, that the most effective moment to act is the one your opponent least expects. The process servers stayed near the entrance. I walked deeper into the room. I spotted Brooke before I spotted my mother-in-law. She was standing near the open kitchen, wearing a cream silk blouse and holding a champagne flute in one hand and her phone in the other, filming herself against the backdrop of the plated appetizers. She was pretty in the way that requires significant effort to maintain, and she wore the expression of someone who believed, sincerely, that this restaurant's success was partly her own achievement. She had helped design the logo. She had styled the menu layout. She had built the Instagram presence. She had done all of this using my money, and she appeared to be entirely at peace with that arrangement. My mother-in-law was holding court near the bar. She was a tall, well-dressed woman in her early 60s who had never particularly warmed to me, though she had been unfailingly polite about it for the duration of my marriage. She believed her son was a genius. She had told him so at every available opportunity since he was approximately 7 years old, and the result was a man who had genuinely never developed the ability to consider the possibility that he might be wrong. She saw me from across the room, and her face moved through 3 distinct expressions in under 2 seconds: surprise, calculation, and carefully reconstructed composure. She crossed the room toward me before I could cross it toward her. "What are you doing here?" she asked quietly, positioning herself between me and the rest of the room in a way that was probably meant to look like a warm embrace from a distance. "I was invited," I said. "Marcus said you weren't attending tonight." Marcus was mistaken. She studied my face for a moment, trying to read something in it. I gave her nothing. She opened her mouth to say something else, and that was the exact moment my husband looked up from the conversation he was having and saw me standing in the middle of his restaurant. I watched the color leave his face. I watched his smile dissolve. I watched him excuse himself from the man in the gray suit and walk toward me with the careful, controlled stride of someone trying very hard to look unhurried. "What are you doing here?" He said it quietly, the way my mother-in-law had, positioning his body to block me from the sightlines of his investors. "I came to celebrate," I said. "You've worked very hard for this. This is not the time. We talked about this. Tonight is a professional event." "I know," I said. "That's why I brought professionals." I looked toward the entrance. He followed my gaze. The 2 men in dark blazers were moving now, walking toward us with the quiet deliberateness of people who had somewhere specific to be. My husband watched them approach, and I saw the precise moment he understood that something was fundamentally wrong with this evening. "Who are they?" he asked. "Process servers," I said. "They have some paperwork for you." The first man reached into his jacket and produced a sealed envelope bearing the court's official seal. He stated my husband's full name aloud, confirmed the address, and placed the envelope in his hands with the businesslike efficiency of someone completing a task they had completed many times before. My husband stared at the envelope. His jaw had gone very still. Around us, the nearest cluster of guests had begun to notice that something was happening, the particular human instinct for impending drama operating at full sensitivity. "What is this?" he asked. "Open it and you'll know," I said. He tore the envelope open with shaking hands. Inside was a notice of commercial lease termination, supported by a 12-page attachment documenting material breach of contract, specifically the unauthorized use of the leased premises to facilitate the fraudulent transfer of marital assets. Clipped behind it was a civil lien notice against the restaurant LLC for the sum of $310,000, corresponding precisely to the amount he had moved from our joint accounts without my authorization or signature. His eyes moved across the first page and then stopped. He looked up at me. "Meridian Real Estate Ventures," he said slowly. "Yes," I said. Something shifted in his face. "That's your company." "It has been for 3 years," I said. "You signed the lease with me, Marcus. You've been paying rent to me for 14 months. I am your landlord. I own the building you are standing in right now." The silence that fell in our immediate vicinity was the specific, dense silence of people pretending very hard not to be listening while listening with their entire bodies. I saw my mother-in-law's champagne flute pause halfway to her lips. I saw Brooke lower her phone from the position she had been filming from and turn her head toward us. My husband said nothing. He looked at the document in his hands and then back at me, and I watched something enormous collapse behind his eyes, not just the shock of the revelation itself, but the dawning, sickening recognition that he had missed something this fundamental for this long. "You can't do this," he finally said. "We are still legally married. You cannot evict me. Any action you take against the LLC is an action against marital property." I smiled. It was the smile Sandra had told me to practice, until it felt completely natural, because she said it would be the most important expression of the entire evening. "The lease was signed before our marriage, Marcus. The LLC predates our marriage. The lease contract contains a fraud and illegal diversion clause. Your own forensic accountant, the one I hired 2 months ago, has already filed the affidavit with the court confirming the unauthorized transfers. The lien is valid. The termination is valid. And as of 11:59 tonight, your 5-year lease is terminated due to material breach." "That's insane. You can't remove me from a commercial lease at a party." "I'm not removing you tonight," I said. "I'm giving you notice, which is what the law requires. You have 30 days. But I thought you deserved to hear it in person." He grabbed my arm. The nearer of the 2 process servers stepped forward immediately, placing a hand firmly on my husband's shoulder. "Sir, please don't touch her," he said. His voice was not unkind, but it was not negotiable either. My husband released me. He looked around the room. Several of his investors were watching now, their faces carefully composed but their attention unmistakable. A food journalist I recognized from a prominent culinary publication had her pen out. 2 of Brooke's influencer friends had their phones raised. "Everyone is watching," I said to him, my voice low. "You should probably decide what you want them to see." He turned away from me and walked toward Brooke, and I watched him say something to her in a low, urgent voice, and I watched her face change. She looked over at me across the room with an expression that I found genuinely interesting, not guilt, not sympathy, but the quick, calculating assessment of someone rapidly reevaluating a situation she had thought she understood. My mother-in-law appeared at my side. "You need to leave," she said, her voice stripped of all pretense now. "You are humiliating him in front of everyone he's spent years trying to impress. Whatever your grievances are, this is not the way." "He humiliated me in front of everyone I trusted," I said. "He moved my money without my consent. He brought another woman into a business I funded. He stood at this bar tonight and toasted a restaurant that exists because of my savings account, and he did not invite me because I was inconvenient to the story he wanted to tell." I looked at her directly. "I am the way, because I earned the right to be." She stared at me for a long moment. Then she did something I had not expected. She put her champagne glass down on the nearest surface and walked out. I did not watch her go. I turned back to the room and waited. It did not take long. The investor in the gray suit had pulled my husband aside near the kitchen pass. I could not hear the conversation, but I did not need to. I could read it in the angle of the investor's shoulders, the closed posture, the deliberate absence of warmth. When a man who has spent a career evaluating risk looks at you across a room where your landlord just served you with a lien notice and a lease termination, the conversation ends in one direction only. The investor shook my husband's hand once, briefly, with the finality of someone closing a file, and walked to the coat rack. Two others followed within minutes. My husband stood in the center of his restaurant and watched his capital walk out the door, and the composure he had been clinging to began to visibly fracture. He turned to Brooke, reaching for her the way a man reaches for the one remaining solid surface in a room that is collapsing around him. Brooke took a step back. "Brooke," he said, "we need to talk to Sandra's firm tomorrow. We can fight this. The lease is challengeable if we argue the LLC was established with shared marital intent. We have a case. I just need you to talk to your father's attorney about a bridge loan to keep us operational through the litigation." Brooke looked at him for a moment with the careful, evaluating expression I had seen cross her face earlier. Then she tilted her head slightly. "Why would my father's attorney be involved in your lease dispute?" she asked. "Because we are partners," my husband said. "We built this together." "Marcus," she said, and her voice had shifted entirely. The warmth was gone, the softness was gone, and what remained was something considerably cooler and more pragmatic. "We were never partners. I was the brand director. You paid me a monthly retainer and covered my content expenses, which, by the way, I'm now understanding came from money that wasn't entirely yours to spend." She glanced toward me across the room, then back at him. "I'm not signing anything. I'm not calling my father, and I am not going to be attached to a fraud case." "This is not a fraud case. She is exaggerating too." "She is your landlord," Brooke said flatly. "She has a court-stamped lien. There is a food journalist in this room who is currently writing something on her phone. My name is on the brand materials for this restaurant, Marcus. I have 40,000 followers who trust my recommendations." She picked up her cream jacket from the back of the nearest chair. "I am not ruining my career over a situation you created." My husband stared at her. "What about us?" he asked. The words came out with a kind of raw, stripped quality that silenced the people near enough to hear them. Brooke looked at him with the compassion of someone swatting a fly. "There was never an us, Marcus. There was a business opportunity that I pursued because you told me you were building something real. You told me your wife was checked out and the marriage was functionally over. You told me the funding was solid and the investors were locked." She shouldered her bag. "You told me a lot of things. Most of them were clearly not accurate." She looked at him one more time, and there was no cruelty in her face, only the brisk efficiency of someone walking away from a bad investment. "Good luck with the 30 days. She walked toward the exit without looking back. My husband stood absolutely alone in the center of the restaurant he had built with my money, surrounded by the warming platters of food no one was eating, and the champagne glasses people had set down on their way to the coat rack. His chef's coat was still perfectly white. His name was still embroidered above his chest pocket. He looked like a man wearing a costume for a version of himself that had just ceased to exist. He walked to me. I did not move. "How long?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "I found out about Brooke 4 months ago," I said. "I found out about the transfers 6 months ago. I've been waiting for the right moment to address it." "You planned all of this." "You planned all of this," I said. "I just decided to participate." He looked at the lease termination notice still folded in his hand. "I have nowhere to go. If you take the building, I lose everything." "You already spent everything," I said. "I'm just recovering what I can." He looked at me for a long time, and I recognized the expression on his face. It was the particular look of a person who has spent years confidently operating under an assumption in his case, the assumption that I was the quiet, reliable, background part of his life who would absorb whatever decisions he made and remain steady, and who has just discovered that the assumption was catastrophically wrong. "I didn't think you'd do this," he said. "I know," I said. I picked up my bag, nodded once to the process servers, and walked out of the restaurant. The November air hit me the moment the glass door swung open, New York in late autumn has a particular quality of cold that feels clarifying rather than miserable, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing it in before I hailed a cab. I did not cry in the taxi. I had done my crying in a hotel bathroom in September after I had confirmed everything I suspected, and I had permitted myself exactly one evening of grief before I had called Sandra and asked her to start building the case. Some women are built for weeping. I was built for spreadsheets. The next 90 days were not pleasant, but they were, in the end, entirely survivable. My husband's attorney filed an emergency motion to challenge the lease termination on the grounds that the Meridian LLC had been concealed from him during the marriage, which was an interesting argument given that he had signed a commercial lease with the company and had been making monthly rent deposits into its account for over a year. The motion was denied in 3 weeks. He filed separately for divorce, which I had already anticipated. His attorney came into the initial mediation session with a claim that the $310,000 I had documented as unauthorized transfers was, in fact, a marital investment that entitled him to equity in my Meridian portfolio. Sandra took 11 minutes to dismantle this argument using the prenuptial agreement we had signed 9 years ago, which contained a clear provision protecting any separately formed business entity I owned prior to the marriage. My husband had signed that agreement too. He had signed a great many things without reading them, which had ultimately become the central theme of his legal situation. The civil lien was upheld. The court issued a judgment requiring him to repay the $310,000 with interest, structured as a wage garnishment against his future earnings as a licensed culinary professional. The judge, a direct, unhurried woman who appeared to have significant experience with cases involving people who had believed themselves to be far cleverer than they were, noted in her written opinion that the defendant had demonstrated a pattern of financial deception and that the plaintiff's documented evidence left no ambiguity about the nature of the transfers. My husband sat across the courtroom in a suit that did not fit him the way his custom chef's coat had, and when the judgment was read, he put his face in his hands and stayed there for a long time. Outside in the hallway, Sandra shook my hand and told me I had been the most prepared client she had worked with in 14 years of practice. I thanked her and took the elevator down alone. It was a Tuesday morning in February, and the city outside the courthouse windows was the flat, gray, unapologetic color of a winter that refuses to be charming about itself. I stood on the steps for a moment and looked at nothing in particular, and I felt something I had not expected to feel, which was not triumph exactly, but a kind of deep, settled quiet. The particular calm of a person who has finished something difficult and is standing in the space just after it ends, before the next thing begins. My mother-in-law called me once, in December, from a number I didn't recognize. She had moved out of her apartment in Westchester after the stress of the proceedings, she said. She was staying with her sister in New Jersey. She had not spoken to my husband in 6 weeks. She said she thought I had gone too far, and I listened to her say so, and then I told her gently but clearly that her son had gone too far first, and that I had simply responded with the tools I had. She did not call again. Brooke posted 2 sponsored content videos in January featuring a different restaurant's tasting menu. By February, she had partnered with a cookware brand. She had not mentioned my husband's restaurant in any capacity since the night of the opening, which I found, on reflection, to be the most honest thing about her. The restaurant space sat dark for 30 days after the lease terminated. I had the locks changed on day 31 by a locksmith who completed the job in 12 minutes and handed me a new set of keys without comment. I stood inside the empty space after he left and looked at the reclaimed wood ceiling beams and the custom marble bar top and the open kitchen my husband had designed with so much pride, and I thought about what to do with it. It took me another month to decide. A year and a half after the night of the opening, I stepped off the elevator on a bright Thursday morning in April and walked into a space I barely recognized. The cold, theatrical atmosphere my husband had cultivated, all drama and performance, had been entirely replaced. The marble bar was gone, traded for a warm, functional counter where 3 financial counselors now sat with clients every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. The open kitchen had been converted into a training classroom where I held monthly workshops for women navigating financial recovery after divorce, business failure, and fraudulent partnerships. The reclaimed wood beams were still there. I had kept those, They were genuinely beautiful. The Meridian Women's Financial Center had been open for 8 months. It had not made me wealthy. The revenue model was partially nonprofit, partially fee-based, but it was full. Every session was waitlisted. Every workshop had women sitting cross-legged on the floor because we had run out of chairs. Women who had trusted people they loved with money they had earned and found themselves stranded on the other side of that trust, who needed not sympathy but information, not comfort but tools. I paused at the front desk to pick up my messages. My office manager, a sharp and wonderfully efficient woman in her 50s, who had found us through our website after attending one of our early workshops, handed me a folder and then pointed wordlessly at the phone. "Garnishment posted this morning," she said. I picked up the phone and opened the banking notification. A direct deposit from a culinary staffing agency, routed through the court-ordered garnishment system, had cleared into the Meridian operating account. My husband was currently working as a line cook at a hotel restaurant in Midtown, the only position he had been able to secure after the judgment went on public record. He would make that deposit every 2 weeks for the next 11 years, at which point the principal and interest would be satisfied. I set the phone down. I thought, for a brief moment, of the man who had stood on the sidewalk outside his empty restaurant in November, watching the door lock behind him. I thought of the embroidered name on his chef's coat. I thought of everything he had built with my money and my silence and my willingness to believe the best of someone I loved. Then I thought of the woman in the workshop room down the hall who had emailed me last week to say that she had opened her own LLC, that she had read the prenup template I provided, that she had scheduled a meeting with a forensic accountant, and that she was, for the first time in 4 years, not afraid. I put the folder under my arm and walked down the hall. The workshop was starting in 10 minutes. The chairs were all full, and 3 women were unfolding extras from the closet in the back. I set my folder down on the table at the front and looked out at the room, at the faces of people who had arrived carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who has discovered they were not seen clearly by a person they trusted completely, and who have decided, after a significant amount of grief, to see themselves clearly instead. "Let's start with the prenup," I said, "because I want you to understand something before we talk about anything else. A document is not a declaration of distrust. It is a declaration that you value yourself enough to protect yourself. Those are not the same thing. The people who told you it was unromantic to ask for one were people who benefited from you not asking." I picked up my marker and turned to the whiteboard. "Write that down." In the back of the room, someone laughed. Then someone else did. And then the room was warm and the windows were bright with spring light, and I began. "The most important thing no one told me, and the thing I will spend the rest of my life telling anyone who will listen, is that loving someone and protecting yourself are not contradictions. They never were. Love does not require you to hand over the deed to everything you've built and trust that someone else will treat it with the same care you would. Trust is earned in increments. Contracts exist because good intentions are not legally enforceable. The women who are most dangerous to cross are not the ones who are angry. They are the ones who are organized. Be organized. Understand every document you sign. Know the name on every lease and the structure of every LLC, especially the ones that have your money inside them. And if you ever find yourself standing in a room full of people celebrating something you paid for while pretending you do not exist, do not leave quietly. You built the room. Act accordingly. If this story helped you think differently about your own situation, share it with a woman in your life who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Mending Stories for more. We are just getting started.